Welcome back to the Deeply Rested podcast. Before I tell you about today's conversation, I want to give you a heads up that new episodes of Deeply Rested are going to be released on Mondays instead of Wednesdays starting next week. If you want to receive a weekly email every Monday with fresh links for our newest episodes, be sure to join our newsletter at deeplyrested.com/newsletter. Now, on to today's episode. Do you ever feel an itch to drastically change what you do for a living? I talk to entrepreneurs every week who used to love their businesses but are now standing at a precipice, wondering if it's time to step into something different. But before you throw the baby out with the bathwater, there's an important question you need to ask yourself. Is it really time to change careers? Or are you just burnt out? Today's guest is my friend Annie Schuessler. Annie is a business coach and the host of the Rebel Therapist podcast. With her Rebel Therapist programs, Annie helps therapists, healers, and coaches create and launch exceptional signature programs. Annie and I originally recorded this conversation for my fundraising event, the Rest and Success Code. At the time, we were talking specifically to therapist entrepreneurs, but rest assured, this conversation applies to any type of profession. Just swap out therapist for whatever work you're doing in the world that you're considering maybe not doing anymore. Annie and I have both gone through cycles of reinvention in our careers, and we have a lot of wisdom to offer other professionals who are navigating this ambivalence. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this conversation with Annie Schuessler. Welcome to Deeply Rested, the podcast that helps people doing good work in the world take incredibly good care of themselves. I'm your host, retired therapist and disillusioned business coach, Megan Megginson. I'm on a mission to help people like you unlearn the rules that keep you trapped in self-doubt so that you can recover from burnout and finally become deeply rested. If you enjoyed today's show, be sure to subscribe to this podcast and join our weekly newsletter at deeplyrested.com/newsletter. Now, it's time for the show. Annie, welcome. I am so happy to have you on this season.
I am so happy to be here, Megan.
You are, in my mind, Annie, one of the few business owners I know who truly exemplifies what it means to be deeply rested and wildly successful. And I'm very excited to learn from you today.
Oh, I'm so excited too. And I think of you the same way. So
thank you. Yes, I feel like you and I are kindred spirits when it comes to, our philosophy around running businesses and how we take care of ourselves. Which is why I'm just psyched to have you here and to be sharing this time with you. And it was hard for that reason to narrow down, what do I want to talk about with Annie Schuessler today? Because there are 100 different topics I feel like we could go into and have a really rich discussion about. But at the end of the day, I decided two things that I want to talk to you about, Annie. First is, I want to hear about your journey becoming, moving from therapist to business coach. And I also want to hear your advice for entrepreneurs listening who are having a really hard time making their business work for them, because this is something I think you are so very good at. So how do those two topics sound to you?
So fun.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, great. Let's dive in then with the $1 million question, especially in the past 18 months for me in my coaching business, which has been to be a therapist or not to be a therapist. I feel like almost every therapist client I have worked with has wanted to talk about the possibility of not being a therapist anymore. And while I'm certainly not here to say that I think that is the path everybody should follow, like I don't think not being a therapist is the burnout solution for every person listening to this conversation. I do think it's the solution for some people. And I know you and I are two people who have chosen to walk away from being therapists and to move into a different path for ourselves. And Annie, I would love to hear about your own journey. How did you go from therapist to full-time business coach?
Yeah. I was a therapist for 20 years and I closed my practice just in the end of April 2020.
Mhm.
And for me, there was this thing about permission. Like for years, I didn't really give myself permission to even ask myself that question about, do I really want to be a therapist? Because there's so much money and time and energy and training that went into becoming a therapist that I found myself as the breadwinner of my family and running a successful private practice. And I felt like, even though I had this feeling like, I don't really think this is for me, like I'm dreading my work, I'm feeling tired, I'm feeling like I'm not feeling that pep that I see some of my colleagues feeling.
Yes, the spark.
Yeah. And I kind of wasn't giving myself permission to really go there. And I kept saying, no, like it's such honorable work. It's such an incredibly important work. I'm lucky to be making so much money. I'm lucky to be helping people. And so I was kind of pushing it away for years. And I remember these little moments, like one of my supervisors, I remember saying that she just loved being a therapist so much she could never imagine doing anything else. And I just remember feeling this kind of shame of, I don't feel that way.
Yes.
And I felt like I should. And then there was this other big punctuation moment when I was on a trip with my three best friends from college. And this was right before I became a business coach. I was talking to them, each of them, about their careers, and I could feel that spark coming from them. So one of them was a professor, one of them was a community organizer, one was a minister, and they all three, it's not that they loved every minute of their work. They were talking about problems they were having. They were all being very vulnerable and real. And I could feel that spark coming off of them that this is the work they want to be doing. They were excited about what was next and excited about what they were building. And I didn't feel that way in my work. I was feeling kind of dread about going back to work. And I was close enough to them to really tell them the truth and to talk about it throughout the weekend. And then when I came home, that was a big moment with my wife where I was afraid to tell her, not because she ever has a bad reaction to anything, but because I was afraid to really be honest about this thing. And I finally told her, I am burning out at this rate. I'm not going to be enjoying my work and something has to give. And I even knew then what I really want to do is business coaching. And I feel like that's such a weird thing to say. And that's such a different thing for me to step into. But it's really what I feel most curious about and what I'm finding myself naturally doing with people informally. And of course, she was just like, do it. That's what you got to do. Like, we don't want you burning out. We'll find a way.
People
Money
make it
works
sound so
out.
simple.
I know, right?
I mean, it is simple at the end of the day, but in that moment when someone says, just do it, you're like, you have no idea how emotionally complex this is for me right now.
Yes. Yes. And so that was the beginning of really opening that door and starting the journey of becoming a business coach and fumbling through the beginning of that process. And then it was a slow up ramping of business coaching and a really slow down ramping of therapy. And if I had to do it all over again, I would do it faster.
Same.
Yeah. I would just, take a bigger leap, take bigger risks along the way. It's not that I really regret the path because I think it's helped me have, I don't regret any relationships I've had, but it just could have happened faster. And I guess I want to save other people some of that time.
Yeah.
If it's right for them.
I feel like the words coming out of your mouth are literally the exact same words that come out of my mouth when I'm telling people about my journey to accepting that I was no longer a therapist. And it's funny to me that you and I have never compared notes on this, because now I'm thinking that I bet this is such a common experience and such a quiet experience that people hold inside, because there is that shame and sort of the compare and despair when you're in a room of your colleagues and you realize. For me, it was when I started my path to becoming an ASEC certified sex therapist. I had to sign up for a 12-month post-grad, intensive training. And I was there, and intellectually it was great. It was very interesting. But it was after the day was over and the cohort would go out to dinner and everyone else kept talking about it.
Oh, interesting.
And that spark was there and that passion was there. They were just like, eating and drinking this for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And I was over it. I was like, day's done, not thinking about this anymore. And that was, when that seed was planted for me of, oh, I'm not as passionate about this work as these people are. And I just remember that moment being so isolating and so shame-inducing of like, ooh, like what does this say about me? That this isn't evoking the same aliveness in me now than that it used to. So to hear that you had that same moment of awareness, I think is really interesting.
I love getting to hear that. Yeah. And it's like everybody's internal technology is so different that I think, for you and I both, we had to find what kind of work fits best with our inner technology.
Yeah. Yeah. What lights me up, in the way, and I just remember sitting there looking at the way sex therapy lit them up. And I just remember thinking to myself, I don't know what makes me feel that way yet, but I'm going to find it.
Yeah.
Because that looks delicious. And I want to feel like that every day. I don't want to feel like this is like a frontal lobe task that I wake up and I think and I do. And like, what is it? What is the work that matches who you are inside? I think that is the $1 million question that for me took lots of therapy to answer. I don't know if that was true for you too, but for me, I had to really name and understand that my identity had become therapist.
Yeah.
Kind of like you were saying, the money, the time, the training. It was like, who is Megan Megginson? Well, she's a therapist. I'm a therapist. And the thought of not being a therapist anymore was terrifying. Like, who am I if I'm not a therapist?
Yeah. And it's an identity that people understand. So even up until a few years ago, when I would meet someone new outside of work and they would ask me, what do you do? I would just find it easier to say, I'm a psychotherapist. And then we talk a little bit about that. And maybe if they were curious, we would end up talking about the business coaching too. But it was just so easy to tell people I was a therapist. And I'm finally, my license actually expires at the end of this year at the same time as I turn 50. And so I will really not be answering it that way anymore.
Yeah.
Ever again.
It'll be like the final nail in the coffin, so to speak, right? It's like, it's done. That chapter is over.
Yeah. Yeah. And you were saying therapy. I think the main, I believe in therapy. The thing that most got me there, I think, was talking to other entrepreneurs and being in like masterminds and online communities and having face-to-face conversations with a lot of entrepreneurs. That was one of the key things that helped me find that permission. And then there was this, I wonder if this ever happened to you, Megan. There was this thing that would happen when I was talking about business with people who were not entrepreneurs or who weren't as interested in business, where I would be the one talking about it too much.
Yes.
And I had one of my best friends at one point say, you get really intense when we talk about this.
Right.
And I feel kind of done with this topic. And I was like, you do?
Yeah.
Like, I feel like we've got 3 more hours to go.
Yeah, easy. Well, also, like, what a great communicator your friend is.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
That's amazing. I don't know that
really
I could do that in a social situation. But that is true, right? I saw a meme on Facebook a couple months ago and it made me laugh. And It was like, you know, your friend's really about to get into something when they sit up straight and say, okay, so, it's like that, like rubbing hands together, like, all right, so let's do this. Let's talk about this. Like there's the spark.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of my best friends now, I love to talk to her about her business. And we do have that back and forth, that titrating where she'll have to say, she says, I have a new idea. I'm really excited about it for my business. And we're going to talk about it for about 5 minutes.
I love that.
We keep going for a while. And then she says, no, that's enough.
Uh-huh.
So, I have to have a place, which is my business, where I get people actually want me to do that with them.
Yeah.
So,
well, and
thank God.
now we get paid to do that.
Yes.
And I think that for me, when I think about being well rested and successful, like that's the combination. It's like the work that you're doing has to be that work that you're like, holy shit, I get paid to do this. I get paid to do the thing my friends would really like me to shut up about.
Yes.
I'm like, I found it, eureka. That is like the alignment.
100%. I remember hearing Liz Gilbert one time say, leave your friends and family alone and talk to people who want to hear this stuff from you. Yep, that's it.
Yes, that is so great. And I remember feeling the opposite when it came to talking to people about therapy, or people would want to talk about what kind of work do you do as a therapist, or the worst case scenario, someone would be like, let me tell you about my marriage, and I would be in relationships where when people wanted to have that conversation with me, I just felt so deflated. Because I could just feel in my body like, oh, I'm not at work right now. I don't want to talk to you about this. Like, I'm done. I left the therapy work in the therapy room. And with my coaching work, it's what you're describing. I'm like, I'll talk about this to anybody who will give me the time of day. Like, this is my favorite conversation. And those two experiences land so differently in my body. And I just so resonate with what you're saying about having to give yourself permission, first of all, to let that be okay, right? To let it be okay that, that you no longer feel as alive when you think about being a therapist as you used to, or maybe you never did, right? But just letting that be okay and trusting that there is something else available to you. Maybe you don't know what it is right now, but there is something else you can get paid for that will light you up. I think trusting that is really important.
Me too. And I love that part of, like, I felt I was really lucky to feel like, I think it's business coaching. But even if I had just been sitting there kind of like, this isn't right for me anymore, I would really hope that I would have been able to pause there and let the next thing show up, because it does. It always does.
It does. For me, it was when I stopped hiding in the shame. Of, I felt it. I felt like I knew in my core, like being a therapist is not for me. It's not the work I'm meant to do. I'm good at it. I've helped a lot of people. I feel totally honored to have, done the work that I did, but it's not for me. And when I was in the shame, I couldn't see what comes next. And I just so agree with what you're saying, that if you name it and give yourself permission to feel it and then be open to what else is there for me, like, you'll figure it out. And maybe you'll go through a few iterations. And I'm curious in your coaching work with your clients, how many people have to go through a few iterations or try on a couple of different hats before they really click into, here I am. This is what I want to do.
Yeah, so many. So many people go through different niches or go through different kinds of business models before they land on kind of the one, or at least one of the ones. And even within business coaching, I did, where I was confused and I needed to experiment with what kind of business coach, because that's still pretty broad. And I thought at times, I don't want to work with therapists, because I was a little afraid of therapists, like that if they were judgmental, I wouldn't be able to handle that. And I think therapists tend to be so smart and so also self-critical that they can be tricky in that way if you're not feeling solid in yourself. And so I had times when I felt like, no, I don't think I should work with therapists. And then I kind of came back around to, yeah, I really love working with therapists and healers, but in a different way.
That feels right to me. I had the same experience when I first started business coaching, where I was like, no, I don't want to work with therapists. I think for me, it was more of like I was feeling burnt out on therapy in general. Like I needed a break from the space. I needed a break from like talking about therapy, being around therapists. And now that I've had that space, I'm like, oh, right, I love you people.
Yeah.
I'm like, I love the work that you're doing. But I think this is important to be really explicit about that. It will take you multiple iterations. Honestly, I hope I'm always iterating for like the rest of my career. I think it would get a little boring otherwise, but it's not as clear cut. You kind of hinted at this earlier that becoming a therapist, the path is so clear. You tell people, I'm going to graduate school to be a therapist. I'm, getting my licensure hours. I'm now fully licensed and in private practice. And I feel like when you take the next step into whatever comes next for you in your career, you lose the clear trajectory. Like there's no degree plan for figuring out what the next thing is you're supposed to do. And I think that can be really scary for people.
Yeah, it's so scary. There's so much freedom, and that freedom can feel scary. Yeah. Constraints can actually be kind of helpful to give us some kind of structure of like what we're choosing between, what we're going to create. Yeah, so I think it's really intimidating for people when they're in that moment of it's not going to be a private practice. Because a private practice, even though there are so many different choices people make in private practice, yeah, there's kind of a structure to it that's expected of, sessions, either in an office or online. And all of that is, you have to make it up yourself when you're creating a business beyond private practice.
And that's really vulnerable. Right? I think that's there's not much vulnerability for people in following the degree plan. You're just doing what you're told. Basically, you're following the instruction manual. And I think that's why private practice burns so many people out too, because you're, working in a way that's prescribed to you instead of really doing the hard, vulnerable work of identifying what do I want to do? How do I want to do it? And okay, I'm going to put that out into the world, even though it's not the thing I'm supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
It's super scary. And it's so helpful to hear you talk about that overlap period that you had, right? And I had it too. I think most of us do. It feels like a low risk way to make a transition. I'm going to keep seeing therapy clients, start doing this other service, and I'll move into one and move away from the other. But every person I talk to says exactly what you just said of, once I'm on the other side of it, I look back and go, I could have done that in half the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I that would have been okay. And I am glad. Yeah, I do love that you're just want people to know that. Like if you're in that transition, chances are it will be fine if you move a little bit faster.
Yeah. And it's like, I'm always in this position with people because I work with people who are right at that edge. I'm always in this position of needing to be patient and remembering they're at that spot of not having the next business up and running and bringing in a great income yet. And so they can borrow a little bit of my faith, but also like I find myself often having to slow down and be like, yeah, that's okay. That's okay. Take it at your pace.
Yeah, right.
Instead of kind of part of me wants to say like, I can see you're going to totally
you're fine.
This.
Yeah, just do it already. Yeah, right. Always easier to say that when you're on the other side. But also it's a great reason that you should have a coach too, because I think most people are ready to hear that. They're ready to hear like, hey, it's okay. Let it go. You're fine. And then they can do that. And then the people who really aren't ready to let go yet, hopefully you have a relationship with your coach, who's going to listen and meet you where you're at.
Yeah.
But I think that giving yourself permission, making the transition, it's so hard and scary, but it's so liberating. And it sounds like that was your experience, is just, wow, to be liberated from work that you were dreading and moving into a space where this spark was alive and the passion, was back for you. It's just really beautiful to hear you describe that journey.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel so lucky sitting here with you and getting to see, like, if the me of 10 years ago were to listen in, she would just be like, "What? This is fantastic." So, yeah, it
And
feels
that
like
is, I mean, that's why I'm so glad we're having this conversation, because I feel the same. I feel like me of 5 years ago, was ready to hear this and couldn't find this conversation anywhere. And I hope that as more of us kind of speak out and say, like, hey, it's okay if you need to pivot. It's okay if, being a therapist was the beginning of your journey. And, it was just the first couple of stepping stones into whatever the next chapter of your career is going to be. I just thinking about what people will create and do as they give themselves permission to pivot is really thrilling.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
all right, I'm sure there are people listening who this is just like landing for them 100%. And they're like, I'm ready to do it. I'm giving myself permission. I'm making a change. And I bet there are people listening who are still really deep in ambivalence about whether or not this is the right path for them. So I would love to hear your thoughts, Annie, on, how do you approach conversations with folks who are really in ambivalence about whether or not they want to continue being a therapist? And maybe you could share, too, some thoughts on your burn your therapy license exercise that I think is really perfect for folks in this situation.
Yeah, that is actually where I would go with folks, is like to do something in your imagination just to create the space to dream into what's next. So it's not really that I'm asking anybody to burn their therapy license, although maybe I will, like on my 50th birthday. That could be interesting. But in your imagination, to take a moment and imagine you didn't have a therapy license. You still have all of that experience, all of that training. But imagine that you burn your therapy license and that isn't a constraint or even a possibility. Then what would you create? So let yourself dream into it. Because a lot of times, being so thoughtful and careful, therapists can tend to run into this moment of starting to get excited about what they could create. And then they take like 5 steps back. And they're like, wait a minute, what about my license? What about the legal stuff? What about the ethical stuff? What if this person sees it or that person sees it and has a judgment? And they just stop themselves in their tracks. So if you're listening and you're one of those people who finds yourself getting stuck before you can even dream into it, in your imagination, burn your therapy license and see what comes up and just like pause there and allow that next thing to arise. And then, there's absolutely no right answer. Like you were saying, Megan, there's no right answer to whether you want to stay a therapist and add something else, or whether you want to do what took me maybe way too long to do and stop being a therapist and leap all the way into something else. There's no right answer there, but I do think opening up that space to dream is a huge part of figuring that out.
I mean, it's such a brilliant exercise. And I find therapists, it's interesting, right? In some ways, therapists are so thoughtful and nuanced. And in other ways, therapists can be very black or white. And I think this is a place where I see a lot of black and white thinking show up with my coaching clients of, I'm either this or that. I'm a therapist or I'm not a therapist. And the dichotomy of that is so scary that they do what you're describing of just, kind of building up the wall of reasons why, they should not explore what comes next. And just this invitation to just close your eyes and imagine that you don't have that therapy license anymore. What would exist on the other side of the constraints that you're working within right now? The other thing that just popped up for me, Annie, as I was listening to you is that I don't think people who are actively in burnout are in a place to make this judgment call. Like, this
Mhm.
is where I see a lot of therapists, there are the therapists I sit with and they have the conversation you and I are having right now of I've known for a long time the spark's not there for me and I'm curious but scared about what comes next. That's a pretty clear, like, yes, you need to explore another path. And then there's that person who is just so burnt out and so, it's they say, I love this work, but I can't do it this way anymore.
Mhm.
And they actually feel really sad when they think that maybe they can't be a therapist anymore. And I'm wondering for you, Annie, what are your thoughts about that, about exploring this question if you in this moment are in, the grip of a deep burnout episode?
Yeah, that's so good, Megan. It's such a big difference. I I mean, you're the expert on this. I feel like they need rest.
Yeah.
They need rest at that point more than they need to imagine what's next. I think what's next is rest. And I know that's so much easier to say than to implement,
Mhm.
but I would desperately feel like I want that person to make small steps towards getting more rest. And that might mean raising your fees. It might mean shifting your schedule so that you're not working at any of the times when you most dread work. I mean, it could mean setting different boundaries around what happens between sessions. So, really taking a hard look at what could give me more rest here and more resources within this work and taking baby steps in that direction. And if you can, take a sabbatical.
Yeah,
I
I was
know
about to
not
say the
everyone
same thing.
can. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a sabbatical is the answer in this.
Hmm.
It's scary and it's hard, but
Hmm.
because I think you're right. I think when you are deep in burnout, that is not the time to make any major life choices. You are
Yeah.
not going to make a good life choice when you are in, such a deep state of exhaustion and suffering. Like, not the place to make a decision about what you want to do with your career. I know, when I took a sabbatical following burnout many years ago, and that was really the game changer for me. Was I had to get away from the whole thing and take a big breath and rest. And then it's amazing the parts of you that come back online when you just get a break and you sleep and you play and you watch TV or whatever you want to do, like, just the core parts of you that show up again, the clarity that you have after rest. It's like, once you're back in groundedness and clarity, that's when I think you should really sink your teeth into this conversation of, what comes next for me.
Yes, 100%. And I find I make so much more money now that I'm well rested as
Mhm.
well. And I say
Yeah.
that because I know that's one of the biggest fears that pops up for people right away is like, yeah, that
Mhm.
sounds nice, but what about money? And I know it's complicated, it's nuanced, it's different for each person's situation. And I was the breadwinner. I mean, I am the
Yeah.
breadwinner.
Yeah.
So that
Same.
was there for me too. And the more I rest and to a certain degree, the less I work,
Yeah.
the more I'm also able to make a great income. So, and I hear that from so many people.
Yeah, I
It's
mean,
not just us.
it's coming from everywhere. In fact, I was late to this bandwagon, but just a couple months ago, I read Essentialism.
Oh, yeah.
Have you read that?
Yes. Yeah.
And I tend to read things like 2 years after everyone else. I don't know. I'm just like, ugh, everyone's reading that. I don't want to read it. I finally read it. I'm like, oh, that's why everyone read it 2 years ago, because it was such a nice way to really encompass this idea of, hey, if you just really get clear on what your greatest contribution is to the world and just commit your life to doing what's most essential, like, you are going to get so much more rest. You're going to be so much happier. And your impact and your income are going to be so much greater than they are when you're kind of stuck in the hustle and grind.
Yeah.
So I agree. The more and it's every year, it's like the more I rest, the more I kind of dial things in, the better off I am in all aspects of my life. It does, I hope it never stops amazing me, because it's so great to just experience a different way of existing in this capitalistic society.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was just talking yesterday to folks about when you're trying to raise your income and you're looking at your business model, it's tempting. It doesn't tempt me anymore. It used to tempt me to add another offer.
Right.
Like, okay, so I've got these 2 offers. They're doing well. If I had a third or a fourth, that'll meet my goals. And like, I'm just always telling people, like, step away from that and double down on what's working. And if I were adding offers and offers and offers, then I wouldn't be getting enough rest. So I just have 2 offers. That's it.
That's what works for you.
That's part of why I can do it that way. Yeah.
I mean, I'm so glad you're saying that and giving folks permission. I mean, there are plenty of people, especially the loud ones in the business building space, who have the energy and the bandwidth to do many things. And that will never be me. As much as I sometimes wish that it weren't true. Like the true me needs like 1 or 2 things and a nap. You know, and I'm like, that's a happy life. That's a really happy life for me. So I love just hearing the way you said that, of keep it simple, dial it in. That's what for you creates a business that really allows you to rest.
Yeah.
I mean, we're kind of moving into my next question for you, which is, what is your advice for exhausted entrepreneurs who are struggling to set clear and thoughtful boundaries for themselves and their business?
I think it's going to be different for everyone, but what works for me is to really decide when I'm working and to then live by that calendar. And I know that would make some people very itchy to even think about living by your calendar. But for me, it's like this deep honoring of what I've committed to and not allowing work to expand beyond that spot. Yeah. And then that really forces me to decide what's most important.
Yeah.
And so if it fits into that time, fantastic. And if it doesn't, that's okay. It will wait. It will be what I work on in 2023 or, another time. But really honoring my calendar and sticking to that.
Well, it's reverse engineering your life, right?
Yes.
It's like you decided, this is what I want my week to look like. This is the number of hours I want to work. This is when I want to be available for my work. And I have a very color-coded Google Calendar.
Me too.
Like my Google Calendar is like, Monday from here to here, you're working on this.
Yeah.
And it's hard for me. It's hard. I am successful 75% of the time at, sticking to those scheduling boundaries. But it is, I think what you're saying is it's so powerful to have a visual of like, this is my boundary. Here it is in the calendar. I've outlined it. And then it makes it so clear when you violate your own boundary, because you can see it on your calendar. You can see that there's an event outside of your green space or, however you have it organized. And so I really appreciate what you're saying. Set the boundary first and then check everything that you want to say yes to against the amount of time you actually have available in your schedule. And if it's not there, then you have to do that really hard thing of saying no to something that feels like it could be a great opportunity.
Yeah. I love this thing that Paula Pant says. She's the host of the Afford Anything podcast. And she talks about how every single thing that you commit to is saying no to something else.
Yes.
And so just looking at my calendar that way. And I bet our calendars look similar. So I use my calendar as my to-do spot as well. So if anything is on my to-do list, it has a spot of when it's happening on my calendar.
Yeah.
So that I just know. And so I look when someone sees my calendar, they usually have this reaction of like, oh my gosh, like you look so busy. I wouldn't be able to handle that. But I'm not. It's just that I've decided what I'm doing with my time.
In fact, you're probably less busy than the person who said that.
Yeah.
You're just clearer and more, diligent about when you're doing what.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel that way for myself, at least. Like when I'm kind of living more by the, flying by the seat of my pants and I'm not scheduling things out, I end up with a week where I said yes to way too many things. But if I put every single thing in the schedule, I'm very rarely overscheduled because it didn't fit. So I said no.
Exactly.
I do. I think especially if you're a visual person, I think that's such a great strategy to kind of hold yourself accountable to a more focused way of living.
Yeah,
And I love
exactly.
coming back to essentialism. It's on my mind now. He has a quote in there, it's if you don't prioritize your life, someone else will prioritize it for you.
Mm-hmm.
And that really spoke to me when I read it. It's like if you don't do what we're describing of having this very clearly outlined schedule where you know where your time is going and who it's going to, someone else will schedule a meeting with you, or you'll say yes to a project you didn't really have time for, and then you get into a cycle of resentfulness, which inevitably I think leads to burnout.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I love planning really far ahead in terms of where I want to be a year from now, and then committing some actions on my calendar to help me get there.
Mm-hmm.
That's like, that to me is that really empowering moment of not letting just default dictate what my year is going to look like. And when I talk to you next year, I won't be like full of regret that, oh, whoops, I didn't do the things that were important to me.
Yeah. And planning like that is hard. I want to really validate that for folks who are struggling. I mean, planning requires deep focus and concentration. For me, it requires, a several hour chunk of time in my schedule where I'm not interrupted and I'm just focused, and I'm really kind of bring myself into a place of deep work and deep concentration to be able to think that far into the future. If I'm in a doing mode, and I'm in my inbox and seeing a coaching client and having a meeting, and I'm like back and forth, I can't plan from that place. And so I think, I see people get frustrated with themselves a lot, that, they're frustrated because they wanted to plan and they didn't. I want to say, but it makes sense to me that you didn't, because you have to make a lifestyle change before you're going to be able to really show up more mindfully and more thoughtfully in your business.
Yeah. And I have to plan to plan. Like I can't, like you said, I can't just sit down this afternoon and make that plan. I have to put a couple or a few hours into my calendar a few weeks from now to really know I'm going to be sitting down. I'm going to be calling in my ancestors, having a moment, and then creating a plan. Yeah.
Yes. I think it was 2 days ago. I think I blocked off a Friday in December because I realized holy shit, the year's almost over. What am I doing with my life? I had slow down. And I looked at the schedule and I blocked off a whole day in December to say, okay, this day is I'm closing the door, I'm turning off my notifications. And I'm just going to, just like you said, I'm going to be with myself, and I'm just going to vision and write it down. And it does take that kind of space and dedication to create this type of clarity.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that.
One other question for you as we're moving here towards the end, even though we could 3 hours, right? We said that earlier. I've heard you talk before about, I think you've called them joy metrics. Does this ring a bell for you?
Yeah, from Thea Monnier. Yeah. So Thea Monnier has a thing with her team where that's one of the things that they focus on, is not just our money, not just the impact we've made, but within the team, what's our joy metric? And every time that they look at an opportunity and decide whether they're going to say yes or not, they look at the joy metric. Is this going to bring me joy to say yes to this? Is this going to bring the whole team joy to say yes to this? So that's really inspired me. And I'm working on bringing that in more as I'm making decisions, and as I'm just looking at my work overall, not just thinking does this help my clients? Does this help my numbers? But also where would I put it in my own joy metric? So I do notice, just with the less I work, the better my business goes. I am noticing the more I pay attention to that joy metric, the better it's going, because I think it helps me do better work.
Absolutely. I mean, I love joy. I love joy. And wherever maybe it was in an email you wrote or something, and I heard you talk about this joy metric. Thank you for sharing. What's the name of the person who coined this?
Thea Monnier.
Thea Monnier. Well, we'll thank her for this concept. It's so powerful. And I know, in my years as a sex therapist, I did a lot of work with pleasure, non-sexual pleasure, and getting people feeling more pleasure in their lives. And that goes right next to joy for me. If this doesn't bring me joy, and if this doesn't feel good to do, if it doesn't feel good in my body, it doesn't feel good in my mind, then it's not my greatest contribution. It might be helpful and, be a useful tool in the world, but there is something I'm really working on of just saying yes, only if it's fully aligned with joy and pleasure. And it sounds like you're experimenting with that as well. And we'll have to report back in another year for folks who are listening to hear
how that went.
How did it go, right? If next year is a year of only saying yes to things that are joyful and pleasurable, where does that lead us? It's a great question.
Yeah. And maybe for me, the first step is, as I'm being really honest about this, is noticing. So noticing if I'm doing something in my business that doesn't really feel joyful, or does feel joyful, just tracking that and seeing where it goes. And also in bringing on a team member, I'm bringing on a team member in a couple of weeks, and that's something we're going to need to dance with together. It's what brings her joy that we're doing and what doesn't, and finding ways to adjust it.
Yeah. This is a whole other conversation we can have is how to, when you grow a team, how do you expand these values and these ideas so that everyone on the team gets to operate by the same rule book? Because it's easy. I found when I started growing my team, both in my group practice and in the coaching business, that it was really easy to default to, well, team members get treated like regular employees. They work 9 to 5. They, everything kind of fit the normal job description. And it really quickly for me, that was out of alignment. I'm like, wait a minute, I don't want to create this life for myself where I have joy and flexibility and then have people work for me who don't also get to experience that. So I'm right there with you on that, Annie, of really exploring and experimenting. How do we create businesses that employ other people where we all get to be in alignment, show up every day with joy, take really good care of ourselves, prioritize our rest? And I think it's a giant paradigm shift from the way our society does business as a whole.
Yes. I'm so glad you said that. Yeah, where it's we're not willing to do capitalism that way, where we're going to kind of try and find joy ourselves at the expense of other people.
Yeah.
And that means we have to be so much more creative and
That's
innovative.
Right.
Yeah.
And we have to be willing to fail. We have to be willing to try some things that don't work out. But yeah, if I'm standing here saying as a business owner, I'm not willing to treat myself like a machine, then I need to be willing to say every person who works for me also will not be treated like a machine. And I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but if we stay committed to this set of values, I bet we can figure it out.
Yes. I love it.
Well, Annie, I have a final question for you today that I'm asking everyone on the Rest and Success Code. And it's pretty simple. I just want to hear, what are the red flags that you notice that sort of indicate you're edging towards burnout? And what are your favorite ways to rest?
Okay, this is a weird red flag, but very accurate for me. And it has been for years. If I don't feel excited about going to a movie, that means I'm really burnt out, because all the rest of the time, you love it. I love going to the movies. It doesn't even have to be that good of a movie. I'll get really excited about it. So if my spouse says, do you want to go to a movie? And my answer isn't yes, that means something is out of whack. And then your other question was, how do I...
what are your favorite ways to rest?
Favorite ways to rest? Besides movies, because that would be one. I love to play games. I love to have a huge expanse of time where we're just like playing card games and board games and drinking tea.
Mm. That sounds delightful. It sounds like a family vacation.
Yes.
I love hearing that. I think it's so helpful when we normalize what it feels like when we burn out, which often are kind of like quirky little signs, right?
Yeah.
So that makes sense to me, like just not having joy in this experience that usually brings you such joy. And then that rest is, I'm just hearing disconnecting, right?
Yeah.
Getting off your phone, off the computer, out of work mode, and just being present in joy with your family. I love it. Thank you for that inspiration.
Yeah. And I like it if I win, but it's okay if I
absolutely. or maybe you're working on that. We all have growing edges, right? I appreciate the honesty. Annie, this conversation it felt so good for me. And I have a feeling that therapists listening who are in that ambivalence or, feeling that the shame of having lost their spark are going to be so inspired by your story. So thank you for being here and sharing this with us.
You're so welcome. Thanks so much, Megan. And this definitely hits my joy metric in a good way.
Yes, mine too. My joy and pleasure metrics are off the charts right now. Really, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Megan.
If you loved learning from Annie Schuessler today and you want to learn more from her, you can join her free mini course for therapists who are ready to create their program beyond private practice. You can download that free mini course at rebeltherapist.me/mini. That's rebeltherapist.me/mini. And of course, you can find this link and all of our resources in today's show notes. See you next week. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Deeply Rested. If you enjoyed this conversation, I would love to invite you to join the Deeply Rested weekly newsletter. You can sign up at deeplyrested.com/newsletter. I hope to meet you in my inbox very soon.